Good morning. My name's Sally Jordan. I'm Professor of Physics Education and head of the current Open University's School of Physical Sciences. I'm delighted to welcome everybody, whether you're here in the room or whether you're joining us online. This is what we in the School of Physical Sciences had always planned to be our final contribution as a school to the STEM faculty's Open STEM talks in the Open University's 50th year. You'll notice, with a bit of simple arithmetic, that the OU's anniversary year was 2019 and it's now January 2020. So, Russ, I'm particularly grateful to you for actually rearranging this talk not once but twice. So Russ, first of all, very kindly agreed to come, and then due to circumstances that were entirely beyond Russ's control, we had to move it twice. So thank you so much, and we're awfully pleased it's not snowing outside. Russ has got a number of claims to fame. When my children were small, they're now in their 30s, when my children were small, Russ was known in our house as the author of the Uncle Albert books. In fact, I think you might have been known as Uncle Albert, but we won't worry about that. I specifically wanted Russ to come and speak of this part of this series because of his involvement with the Open University from the very beginning, and that's what Russ will indeed be talking about. He'll be talking about his early history, how he came to go to university in the first instance, the work he did, but then, importantly, how he came to work at the Open University. When Russ joined us he joined us in 1969, and there's actually more about that in this delightful book. I don't know if anybody else has a copy. I got it around about our 25th anniversary, I think. It tells a lot of these stories, and it's a lovely story. After first joining us, Russ had a long and distinguished career at the Open University, including head of what was then the Department of Physics, and he's now Emeritus Professor of Physics. I've got a second prop with me. I used to be really sort of organised, and when I'd been to residential school, I used to write it in this little book, all about it. And a little digging around led me to discover that I first met Russ on the 9th of July, 1994. A lot of people had known him for longer in this audience. I know I've been sharing some memories before. I was at residential school in Reading, and it was a memorable week for a variety of reasons, not least the fact that rather than the usual situation, which I as a woman had in a physics lab at a residential school of normally being the one woman in a lab that was mostly staffed by men, there were 3 women on the team this week, and Russ was the senior tutor. The students had a great week, and so did we. Russ never, I think, knew about a little problem we had in the middle of the week. The rest of the tutors, we went out for the day, on an afternoon off. We went on a trip to Henley or something like that. But then in the middle of a roundabout, in the middle of a rush hour, in the middle of Reading, we ran out of petrol. I think it was something of a miracle he got the rest of the team back. So lots of other people have told lots of interesting stories, and I'm sure there'll be more discussion like that as we go. Talking about things going wrong, we're not expecting a fire drill. Should that happen, the exits are through the door you came in, and there's another door up behind you at the back there. They bring you down out to where we were having coffee, and the fire assembly place is right outside the Beryl Lecture Theatre. Just to alert you to the fact that this talk is being streamed online, so when we get to the question and answer session, if you could wait for the microphone to be brought to you so that everybody can hear the questions. And those people who are listening online, if you have any questions to ask of Russell, please can you email them to me. That's sally.jordan@open.ac.uk, and I'll pick them up and ask Russ. So, again, It's great to have Russell with us. It's great to have his wife, sons and grandson, and the other Russell Stannard as well. And without further ado, can we please welcome Professor Russell Stannard, who's just going to speak on the subject, The Early Years of the Open University, A Personal Account. Thanks, Russ.
Okay, well, I suppose I ought to begin by making it clear that this is not going to be some kind of official history of the Open University. If you want that kind of thing, I'm sure you'll find it on the internet. Now, I'm what's called a 69er, which was the nickname given to those of us who joined at the very beginning in 1969. After 50 years, there aren't many of us left. So this is, if you like, a rare opportunity for getting some feel for what it was really like to be working to set up the OU all those years ago. So it's going to be a very personal and anecdotal kind of talk. I just want to give you the kind of flavour of the way things were then. Okay, well, it was Harold Wilson who announced that he intended to set up the Open University. He described it as the University of the Second Chance. It was intended that it should serve those who, for whatever reason, had failed to have higher education earlier on. It was going to be innovative, employing such media as TV and radio, the white heat of technology, as he famously described it in those days. The idea immediately appealed to me, and to understand why, you have to know that I come from a very working class background. I was born in Brixton in London. My mother was a conductor on the London buses, and my dad was a doorman. I went to South Lambeth Road School. You can get some idea what kind of school that was when I tell you that when I passed the 11 plus exam, I was hauled out in front of the whole school, and the headmaster made this speech. This boy is on the first rung of the ladder. They hadn't had someone pass the 11 plus exam in years. So the idea of going to a grammar school, let alone a university, was absolutely out of the question. And that kind of background always stuck with me, because I was only too aware that there had been nothing special about me. There were others in the class who were just as capable as I was, but they didn't have the advantage of the parents that I had. My parents, although both of them had to leave school at the age of 14, they nevertheless recognized the importance of education, and so they always insisted that I take my studies seriously. So with the announcement of this University of the Second Chance, I immediately recognized that this was a way in which I could help those who hadn't been as fortunate as myself. Okay, I know that sounds very idealistic, but the truth is that the first wave of OU staff were very idealistic. A number of them, for example, had taught for a year in Africa. John Dodd, I remember, spent 4 years doing voluntary service overseas before he joined the OU, that sort of thing. And we were very much going out on a limb. Now, these days, the OU is such an established feature of UK society that it's almost impossible now to appreciate just how much hostility and scepticism it faced originally. Iain Macleod, the Conservative Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, had declared that the first thing the Tories will do when they get back into power is to stop that blithering nonsense called the Open University. Here we were, most of us in safe, tenured jobs in established universities, giving them all up. for something which might very well not exist in a year's time. I myself was on the staff of University College London. We were giving it up despite the fact that the next general election was due in less than a year. So yes, we were idealists. But of course, to be fair, a more mundane motive for joining the OU was the prospect of appearing on the telly. The first staff were, as I say, recruited in 1969. I applied, was interviewed, and was taken on. One day, whilst I was still serving out the rest of my time at UCL prior to taking up my new post, I was accosted by Bob Ross, a friend of mine from the UC chemistry department. He stopped me and said, "Ross, what is this I hear about you joining this fly-by-night outfit called the Open University? Tell me it's not true." I assured him that it was true. He promptly launched into this long harangue about how stupid I was being. He said how it can't possibly succeed. For starters, you're going to admit anybody, including those with no previous qualifications. You'll have to go through the whole of the O and the A-level syllabus before you even get started on degree work. I replied that we would just have to find ways of bringing students up to degree work quickly without having to plough through the whole normal syllabus of O and A-levels. Then he continued, "But it's just a glorified correspondence college. Don't you realize that correspondence colleges have an 80% dropout rate?" I said how it consisted of more than just correspondence. TV and radio would be involved. There would be summer schools. We planned to set up study centres throughout the country where students could meet up with a tutor and other students. He went on, "It'll just be a teaching college. Once you're in it, you'll never be able to get back to a proper normal university. Recruitment and promotion in universities depends on research. Nobody cares about how good a teacher you are." I responded that it was not going to be purely about teaching. At our interviews, we had been promised that we would be able to continue with research. "And how do you expect to teach science without practical work?" he said. I told him about the home kits we would be sending to students so they could do experiments in the home. "Oh," he said, "you're going to send them a kid's chemistry set?" I said, "No, it's not going to be like that. There will be a microscope, laser, oscilloscope, and equipment of that sort. Moreover, they will spend most of their time at summer school in the science laboratories." He carried on. "It's the University of the Second Chance, yes," he insisted. "It's for those who missed out. But with the Russell expansion in the number of universities, nowadays anybody can go to university. Anybody who's any good. So once you've mopped up the backlog of those who've missed out in the past, where are your future students going to come from?" That was an objection which really hit home, because in those days we had no idea as to where we would go after the first year. And so the argument went on, getting more and more heated. I was getting very angry. After all, what was he doing? Bob was simply rehearsing all the standard arguments that were going around at that time as to why the Open University could not possibly succeed. People were passing us, looking at us, wondering what the row was about. Then all of a sudden, Bob changed tack. He put his arm on my shoulder, consoling me, and he said, Russ, calm down. No, he said, "It's just that today I have myself joined the Open University. I just needed somebody to tell me I'd done the right thing. Okay, well, the OU started up in October 1969. At that time, we occupied a rented house in Belgrave Square, London. And that's all the OU consisted of. But soon we made the move to the new city of Milton Keynes. We took over the existing country house, Walton Hall, together with its 70 acres of grounds. Temporary huts were swiftly erected, and that is where we worked while the permanent buildings were being constructed around us. Effectively, we were working on a building site. There was a sea of mud everywhere. It was so bad that on entering the huts, we had to take off our shoes and don slippers specially provided by the university. Indeed, our building site was just part of an even larger building site, which is all that there was of the developing city of Milton Keynes. It was largely because of the ominous threats coming from the Conservatives we knew we had to work fast and make the enterprise unstoppable by the time the Tories had a chance of getting back into power. It was decided we would take on the first wave of 24,000 students at the start of 1971. That gave us 16 months to get the first courses up and running. It was going to be a very tall order. The first courses to be offered were 4 foundation courses in science, arts, social science, and mathematics. The science course would include contributions from the departments of physics, chemistry, earth science, and biology. Each of these 4 disciplines was to have a staff of 4 academics. In those days, we thought 4 would be enough. Little did we know. Besides the academics, there were BBC producers and educational technologists. Together, we made up the Science Foundation course team. All of which was a bit of a culture shock for us. Though quite a number of us were used to the idea of working in a team when it came to research, the thought of producing a course through a team, rather than simply going into a lecture theatre and doing your own thing, was unheard of. The main component of the course was to be the books we were to write. The material was to be divided into 32 sections, or units, with a particular academic assigned to look after each unit. The first task was to produce an outline of what each unit would contain. These were discussed by the course team and modifications made to make sure that the whole course cohered together. Each academic had then to produce a first full-length draft of the unit and submit it to the scrutiny of all the other members of the team who then met to discuss it. Such discussions were invariably traumatic. The criticisms could be harsh in the extreme. One had to develop a thick skin if one was to survive these interrogations. Academics normally, as you know, never have other academics eavesdropping in on their lectures. They can just do their own thing, but not here. But it was worth it. Throughout my time at the OU, each unit I wrote was, so I thought, pretty good, even in the first draft. But having had it subjected to this kind of peer review, I had to admit that every single time the unit that eventually went to the printers was much, much better than what I had at first prepared. Integral to our work was the contribution of educational technologists. Okay, much of what they had to say struck us academics as a load of waffle. But beneath all the guff, there were important lessons for us to learn. In particular, they addressed the problem of how to get students with less than, say, O-level up to degree work rapidly. They first of all made us define our assumed entry behavior. In other words, we had to be clear about what we were assuming the students could be expected to know to begin with. We then had to define our objectives. This meant specifying what we expected students to be able to do as a result of a set piece of teaching. And note the word do. It was not sufficient to say, well, I want them to understand or appreciate so on and so. We had to give details of how they would demonstrate their understanding, perhaps by being able to tackle certain kinds of exam questions. Having identified the assumed entry behavior and the objectives, it was then a case of charting the quickest routes from one to the other. This approach, though unfamiliar to us and difficult, it was difficult to get used to, it actually worked wonders. It completely altered my own teaching. With the teaching of quantum physics, for instance, instead of rambling through the history of the subject with all its blind alleys, with this new technique, one was able to go from virtually no background knowledge to some kind of understanding of the subject. And so it was, even in the science foundation course, we physicists were able to introduce students to frontier subjects such as relativity, quantum physics, and high-energy nuclear physics, which was my own research interest. In other words, our students were doing degree-type work from the very beginning, thanks to those educational technologists. And the work of those educational technologies was not confined to simply laying down the broad kind of strategy for us to follow. For each unit, they took the first draft and went through it with a fine tooth comb, underlining in a blue pencil every scientific term we were using, and challenging us as to whether it was reasonable to assume the student knew the meaning of them. As a rule of thumb, they told us, if you are introducing a term that you would be surprised to overhear someone use while shopping in a supermarket, you probably need to define it. If dealing with a more complex idea, we had to prepare a remedial package so that the less well-prepared student could temporarily be diverted out of the main text, take the remedial package, then come back in and join the main one. We were constantly reminded to, I quote, remember the student on the Isle of Mull. The units we were writing had to be completely self-sufficient and should ideally include the answers to all possible queries of this mythical character living on the Isle of Mull. Associated with the written units were the other aspects of our multimedia approach. For instance, there was the home experimental kit to be planned and put together. I well recall coming across some 3D bubble chamber photographs of the tracks left by subatomic particles. Using a stereoscopic viewer, they looked absolutely fantastic. I immediately decided I would include these in the home experiment kit in order to enliven my unit on high-energy physics. Some months later, I happened to be wandering through the warehouse here on campus where the items for the home kit were being assembled. I noticed this huge stack of brown boxes. It was about the size of a normal-sized room. I casually asked one of the storemen, well, what's all that lot? And he looked up his worksheet and said, oh, stereoscopic viewers for the science course. I thought, God grief, is that what 6,000 stereoscopic viewers look like? Originally, I hadn't taken more than 20 minutes to make up my mind to include them in the kit. And this was the result. And that is how things were in those days. We were making instant decisions on the hoof. We had to. The kind of decisions that years later, when bureaucracy took over, would require several committee meetings to decide. Then there were the summer schools to plan. It was essential that all students on the Science Foundation course should spend a week in a conventional university, mostly working in the laboratories doing experiments that we had to devise for them. And next there were assignments and exam papers to prepare. We would not ourselves be marking these. That would be a job for part-time tutors. But we had to prepare the marking schemes for them so that the standard of marking would be uniform. And finally, there was that aspect of the work that I suspect many of us academics have been looking forward to, working alongside our BBC producers in creating TV and radio broadcasts. The TV programs being made at Alexandra Palace, in the very studio where the world's first ever public TV programs were made. Those OU broadcasts going out late at night on BBC Two. It has to be said that our partnership with the BBC could at times be strained. We academics had to be licked into shape in order to become broadcasting presenters. Understandably, the BBC producers did not relish the idea of being lumbered with lecturers who, though experts in their academic field, were simply not suited for this kind of activity behind the microphone or camera. But not all those who were stiff and wooden and awkward volunteered to step down, leaving this part of the work to their more able colleagues. And as a result, some of our programs became the butt of comedians' jokes. My own experience was mixed. Somehow I took to TV quite naturally. It didn't happen automatically, of course. There's nothing natural about talking to a TV camera lens. But I had good advice from the main science producer, James Macleod. He told me to get into the habit that when I went home, go into your bedroom, close the door, and talk to the door handle. And that's what I had to do. I had to imagine it attentively listening to me and having a little laugh at any amusing asides that I might make. Another key to success was that Macleod, unlike the producers in the other faculties, would not allow us science academics to use auto-cue. In the arts faculty, for example, opposite numbers were forever reading their lines off the camera lens. We in science were forbidden to use that crutch. This was because so often we were demonstrating scientific equipment and doing experiments. We needed to be looking at and concentrating on what we were doing rather than looking over our shoulder and reading our lines off the camera lens. And the fact that we had to memorize our script was another reason why some academics were not comfortable doing TV. And there were other causes of strain between academics and BBC staff. For instance, a clear distinction had to be made between what constituted scientific apparatus, used for demonstrations, and stage props, such as tables, stands, and display boards. If a display stand needed adjusting, that was the job of the stage hand. That's what he was there for, and an academic must not touch it, which was difficult to get used to. Each program lasted 25 minutes. You spent the day rehearsing. There was then a short compulsory tea break until 4:15. You then had to get the program recorded and in the can in 1 hour. And 1 hour meant 1 hour. There was a union man in the recording studio standing at the producer's elbow, and if one exceeded the time limit of 5:15 by as much as a second, that was 1 hour's overtime for all the BBC staff. Getting a 25-minute program recorded in 1 hour is no mean feat. And that was an added pressure on the academic doing the presenting. As I said, I myself was able to take to the TV medium without too much difficulty. Radio was a different story. Unless you have yourself been involved in both TV and radio, it is hard to realize just how different they are from each other. Basically, a TV presentation can be more informal. You don't have to be concerned about the minutiae of what you're saying because there are so many visual cues to help the viewer get the message. They can see what you're doing. They can see the expression on your face. They can read your lips, so you don't have to enunciate too clearly. You can be yourself, interacting in much the same way as you would with someone in a face-to-face situation. But with a radio talk, all the listener has to go on, of course, is the speaker's voice. The words have to be carefully chosen and spoken with care. One has to allow for the possibility of the listener's attention wandering for a while. Not necessarily because they're bored. You might have said something that was so intriguing that they were following that train of thought. In which case, they are no longer listening to you. They're lost in their own thoughts. So you better not be saying anything important. Thus, the script has to have built-in redundancy. And then, when you're about to make another important point, you have to recapture their attention. This you do not by raising your voice, but by pausing. You don't have to be a Harold Pinter to notice just how important pausing can be. It's very effective at grabbing attention. So what I'm saying is that the script has to be carefully structured, and you have to read from the script, which all seems perfectly straightforward, except that my radio programs were quite frankly horrible. My voice was flat and monotonous. It was obvious to the listener that I was simply reading from a prepared text. I dreaded doing radio. I got to the point where I seriously considered throwing in the towel and telling the producers that they would have to find someone else to stand in for me. I'd stick to TV where I felt more comfortable. And then came the day I was due to record a radio program, only to discover the producer that I had worked with over the preparation of the script was unwell. His place had been taken at the last minute by a retired BBC producer who had agreed to step into the breach. He was an elderly, gruff, no-nonsense type of fellow. There was I in the studio, sitting at a desk, script in front of me, microphone about a foot away. The producer was in the recording booth. I could see him and the recording engineer through the window. The producer called out, "When you're ready," on the green light. The green light flashed. And I began. I hadn't got to the end of the second paragraph when his voice boomed out again. "Hold it there, I'm coming through." He entered the studio, clearly far from pleased. He stood there looking at me for a while, doubtless wondering how to break the news to me. Suddenly he turned on his heel, he marched over to the far corner of the room, about as far as the end of the screen here. And from there he called out, "Okay, try it again, from the top." I did as he said. Again he interrupted me and he said, "I can't hear you." Can't hear me? I thought, well, of course he can't hear me. He's right over there. I'm talking to this microphone here. So I raised my voice a bit. Again he interrupted me. Still can't hear you. I put even more effort into it next time, with the same result. Still can't hear you. So I thought, well, this is ridiculous. I'll show him this time. I shouted the lines. I shouted them out loud. Okay, he called out to the recording booth. Play that one back. The engineer played it back. I was staggered. It was perfect. It was a proper BBC radio voice. It sounded so natural, as though someone was speaking to me in the same room. Okay, said the producer, that'll do. We'll record that one. Keep it like that. I said, I don't understand. I was shouting. Shouting, he said. We call it lifting it off the page. The volume doesn't matter, we can turn that down. This time your voice had life, animation. That's what it's about. And I still look back with wonder at that session in the studio. I feel immensely privileged to have been coached by such a wise old head. Without his insight and wealth of experience, I would never have made the grade. I would never have come, as I did, to love doing radio. Okay, that gives you an idea of what course production was like. On the 18th of June, 1970, against all expectation, Edward Heath and the Conservatives won the general election. This was 8 months before we were due to take in our first students. Bearing in mind the threats made earlier by Iain Macleod, we held our breath. Did this spell the end of the OU? Was it to be strangled at birth? Much to our relief, I suppose one oughtn't to put it quite like that, Iain Macleod died 1 month after the election, and the new government had other things to worry about, and the OU slipped under the radar. So we were all right. And so it was at the start of 1971, we had our 4 foundation courses ready. 6,000 students had been enrolled on the science course. The university had divided the country into 13 regions, each with a regional office. These were to be responsible for looking after the students in their region. A total of 300 study centres were set up using existing premises, schools, universities, that sort of thing. Part-time tutors had been hired, these mostly being academics from other universities who wished to earn some extra pocket money. These were to meet students face-to-face at the study centres, as well as mark written assignments, and at the end of the year, mark the exam papers. So, all was set for the launch, when disaster struck. A postal strike. Here we were, effectively, a glorified correspondence college, according to Bob Ross, completely dependent on a postal service, and there wasn't one. And this was no brief stoppage, it was the last 6 or 7 weeks. it was a matter of all hands to the pump. Having spent a full day doing our normal academic work, we then in the evening had to go into the warehouse here, stuff envelopes, pack up boxes. There were lorries outside. We used to pack the boxes into the lorries. The lorries then went round the country to the regional offices, delivering the course units, which were then sent out to distribution centres where the students could pick them up. Happily, we weathered the storm until the strike was over, and things at last were settled down into a proper routine. So, having just about exhausted ourselves preparing the foundation courses at breakneck speed, it then suddenly dawned on us that this was but the beginning. In the second year of their study, the students, having completed the general foundation course in science, they'd been wanting to start specializing in their own particular subject area. In the second year, we would have to provide not one, but 4 courses, one in each of the science disciplines. And with just 4 academics per discipline, that was just impossible. So extra staff were recruited, and this was but a foretaste of what was to happen over the ensuing years. Like Topsy, the OU grew and grew and grew. More courses, more faculties, more students, more part-time tutors, until it grew into the OU we know today. But back in those early days, no one could have anticipated this. Indeed, one of our great worries was whether there would be any applications at all in the second year, 1972. As had been suggested by our detractors, once the backlog of people who had missed out on higher education had been mopped up, what then? In fact, to our enormous relief, the number of applications for a place in the second year was even greater than in the first. Don't ask me why. I suspect it had something to do with the TV broadcasts. TV and radio broadcasts proved a wonderful way of making sure everyone in the country was being constantly reminded of our existence. And along with all this came the gradual realization of just how good the OU teaching was. This should not in itself be taken as a criticism of lecturing in other universities. I once worked out that when one took into account all the work academics had to put into the preparation of the various components of the OU science teaching package, 50 hours of academic time was spent on preparing each 1 hour that a student spent studying the material. And obviously no ordinary lecturer in a conventional university can invest that amount of preparatory time. What else can I say? Well, openness was always an ongoing concern. The OU should be open to everyone regardless of circumstances. That was the idea. So, for example, take the problem of colour TV. Our first TV programmes were, of course, in black and white. When colour TV came along, obviously we would like to make use of it, especially if you're demonstrating, say, optical experiments. But when could we assume that our poorer students could afford a colour TV? Then came video recorders. It was now possible to record the late-night TV programmes and play the programmes at a more convenient time. And also, we were able then to pack in more teaching material. But could the students afford to buy one of these newfangled recorders? We had the same problem when DVDs came in. It was then possible to dispense with the broadcast altogether and just mail the DVDs to the students directly, if they could all be assumed to have a DVD player. And of course, with the recent increase in tuition fees, the problem of maintaining openness, as you know, is still very much with us today. Changing the subject, I should mention the celebration of the OU's 10th anniversary. It was attended by the Queen and Prince Philip. An exhibition was set up. I was manning a stall devoted to my own line of work, which, as I said, was high-energy physics. My research group worked in collaboration with my former research group at University College London. My exhibit concentrated on an experiment we were conducting at the CERN laboratory in Geneva. Prince Philip arrived at my stand. He studied it and then pointed to one of the photos and declared that that is not the accelerator at CERN. I was thunderstruck. He was right. It wasn't. As I had to explain to him, I said, well, no, that's the accelerator at the Fermi lab in Chicago. The one at CERN, as you obviously know, is buried in the ground. You can't see it from the air, so I just have a photograph of this one to show you how big these things are and how round they are. Honestly, Prince Philip's background knowledge is phenomenal. Then came the Queen. I explained to her about the tracks left by subatomic particles in the bubble chambers and invited her to look through the stereoscopic viewer to see them, the same viewer that is in the Science Foundation home kit. So she bent down and took a look and then politely said, "How interesting." And then she moved on. Whereupon a courtier sidled up to me and fiercely muttered in my ear, "You shouldn't have done that." I shouldn't have done what? You shouldn't have made Her Majesty bend down. I said, why have I not? There are photographers around. We don't want Her Majesty to be photographed in an unseemly posture. So that was me told off. Okay, well, that's as much as I want to say about the early days. As for the present state of the university, obviously you know far more about it than I do. But I wonder how aware you are of just how all-pervasive the influence of the OU is today. Take, for instance, institutions abroad that are to some extent based on the OU model. Whilst I was OU Pro-Vice Chancellor here, I was myself involved as a British Council consultant in the setting up of the first of these foreign adventures. It was in Pakistan. They were in a lot of trouble, and I was sent out there to make recommendations and so on. It all worked out in the end fine, and today that university has 1.2 million students. And that is just one of, I understand, something like 60 foreign institutions which owe their origins in some way to this Open University. But even here in the UK, the OU has an all-pervasive influence that goes far, far beyond the awarding of degrees. Let me, in fact, end on a very personal note, showing how the training in the use of media that I received here at the OU has transformed my own life and reached out into society in various completely unrecognized ways. Recall how I started out absolutely useless at radio until that BBC producer taught me to lift it off the page. From then on, I enjoyed doing radio. I went on to make a radio series for the BBC Radio 4 called Science and Wonders. 5 45-minute programs going out immediately after the Archers at prime listening time. It was a series devoted to studying the relationships between science and religion. I should perhaps explain that in addition to being a physicist, I'm also a licensed lay minister in the Church of England. So I have a foot in both camps, sort of thing. The idea was for me to interview leading scientists, philosophers, psychologists, and theologians here and in the USA, both believers and atheists. I myself had in mind initially that we would be doing these interviews in a studio, but the producer, who was an OU radio producer, Norman Winter, he had different ideas. He said, no, we have to go out on location. I thought, this is radio, why go on location? Oh, he said, we have to open the programs out. I hadn't a clue what he was talking about, but he was dead right. So, for example, when we were discussing evolution with Professor Sam Berry, we did that at Darwin's house, sitting in the very seat and at the very table where Darwin wrote on the origin of species. And then when Norman learnt that the psychologist Montague Barker and I were likely in our interview to make critical remarks about Sigmund Freud's views on religion, he said, okay, well, that interview must take place at Freud's house. And when you make those remarks, I want you sitting on Freud's couch. Sitting on Freud's couch! It's absolutely forbidden. But it's amazing what you can get away with when you're able to say, but we're from the BBC. So that's what happened. The series was selected by the Sunday Times as the #1 radio achievement of the year, which when you think back to my first stumbling steps in radio was quite a transformation. The success of that series, in fact, led to me being asked to do a Thought for the Day on Radio 4 in the Today programme. In fact, I went on to do 50 broadcasts on Thought for the Day. And those broadcasts led to my receiving a telephone call early one morning. It was 8:30. I was in the bedroom getting dressed. The phone went, and this voice said, "Is that Professor Stannard?" I said, "Yes." "Who's calling at this hour?" "I am the master of the Queen's household. Her Majesty has asked me to inquire whether you would care to take lunch with her. It will be on the 26th of November. I thought, yeah, pull the other one. It's clearly a hoax. And I thought, I don't recognize the voice. In fact, I don't know anybody who talks that posh. And in fact, it turned out to be genuine. And so I found myself at Buckingham Palace, in the dining room there, sitting next to the Queen. Prince Philip was opposite. The corgis were at our feet. It all come about because the Queen and Prince Philip always listened to Thought for the Day, and they just thought they'd like to meet me. I was terrified. But the Queen very quickly put me at my ease. We talked about science and religion. We talked about the Open University, of course. And we talked about the books that I write for children. Throughout the meal, she broke off delicate pieces of toast and surreptitiously slipped them down to the corgis. In fact, there was one dog which was skulking over in the far corner of the room. And at one stage, she broke off a particularly large piece of toast, turned in her seat, and flung it across the room. I was appalled. I thought I would never allow my children to throw food around the dining room. But then I suddenly remembered how Henry VIII used to toss chicken bones over his shoulder, so I just assumed it was something royal people do. Okay. Okay, well, that very memorable occasion would not have happened had it not been for Thought for the Day. Thought for the Day would not have happened had it not been for that series, Science and Wonders. And Science and Wonders would not have happened had I not been told here at the OU. Lifted off the page. Then we have my OU training in TV. That led to my making a video series called The Question Is. Again, it was about science and religion. And again, I worked with an OU BBC producer, this time David Poyser. It was aimed specifically for use in religious education lessons in schools, complete with a teacher's booklet. It was launched at a press conference at the Science Museum in London, and it certainly filled a need because it was bought by 40% of all UK secondary schools. Again, that people watching that series, they don't think about the Open University because it's got nothing directly to do with the Open University. But if I hadn't been trained here at the OU, it would not have happened. And then there's my book writing, which Sally briefly mentioned. I told you how OU educational technologists taught us academics about assumed entry behavior and setting objectives, this being a way of rapidly getting first-year students to study advanced modern physics. But I got to wondering, how far can you take that practice? Could one, for instance, teach Einstein's theory of relativity to children, 11 years old, say? You know, getting in quick before they're brainwashed into thinking that only a genius understands what Einstein's all about. And so it was, I had long conversations here at the OU with the educational technologists about this. They pointed me to the work of Piaget and later workers in child psychology, Scheer, Addy, Wylam, people like that, and how children marshal their understanding of the world, the difference between concrete operational thinking and formal thinking, all that sort of stuff. So I immersed myself in all this, and based on all that information, I set to and wrote a book called The Time and Space of Uncle Albert. It read like a science fiction adventure story, except that the science in this case was true. It was Einstein's special theory of relativity. Okay, I thought, well, you know, am I kidding myself? Children understanding relativity. Well, here at the OU, when one was producing a particularly innovative course, it tended to be developmentally tested on volunteers before it went public. I thought, okay, I'll do that. So I contacted local schools and I recruited 100 11-year-olds, got them to read The Time and Space of Uncle Albert, and then I set them an exam. And sure enough, they'd understood it all right, and moreover, they seemed to enjoy it, so I knew the book worked. But then, in exactly the same way as there had never been an OU before this one was set up, and as I've told you, the response was largely hostile and skeptical, there had not been a book like this. So it too was met with hostility and skepticism. It was rejected by 17 publishers before, of all people, Faber and Faber accepted it. Despite the fact that the children's editor told me afterwards that of the unsolicited manuscripts that she received, like mine, she accepted for publication no more than 1 in 2,000. So it was a very close call, but it sold out in 3 weeks. It was shortlisted for the Children's Science Book of the Year, and at the same time also for the Children's Fictional Novel of the Year, as well as the American Science Writing Award. And it's currently in 22 translations. That was Einstein's Special Theory of Relativity. A subsequent book, Black Holes and Uncle Albert, dealt with general relativity. And then Uncle Albert and the Quantum Quest was an introduction to quantum theory. The latter book was not only the top best-selling children's book, but it also, for one glorious week, got to number 5 in the adult paperback bestsellers list, beating Joanna Trollope, John Grisham, Jeffrey Archer, and all that lot. Not bad for a child's introduction to quantum physics. Recall how I told you about receiving a phone call from Buckingham Palace regarding lunch with the Queen. So would you believe it, I got another call from the palace. This time I was told that the palace had sent copies of my Uncle Albert books to the Emperor of Japan in the Japanese translation. The Emperor was due to make a state visit here, and the palace staff said, I quote, "We thought the Uncle Albert books would make an interesting topic of conversation during the state visit." So don't ask me why. Then when I was at the palace again some time ago, receiving my OBE, as the Queen pinned the medal on me, she leant forward and confided, "I have passed your Uncle Albert books on to Prince Harry." I doubt very much that he read them, but I only hope he passes them on to Archie. Again, I stress that these books, like the radio and the TV series, have nothing directly to do with the OU, but they certainly would not have happened but for the unique multimedia training I've been privileged to receive here at the OU. As I say, the OU's influence goes far, far beyond the mere awarding of degrees. I myself am so grateful to this wonderful institution for all that it's done for me. And I'm delighted to have had the opportunity of showing my appreciation by coming here and sharing my experience with you on this anniversary year. Thank you for coming and listening or joining us online. My final words to you are, keep up the good work. Thank you.
I actually almost don't know how to follow that. Russ, what you've done is it's an absolute, the communication, all of the things that you've taught about what you learn, we've seen it personified. It was absolutely fantastic. That's one thing. The other thing, those of us who, I mean, that passion for the OU's openness, the open to people, places, methods and ideas. I mean, it just sings through everything that we still try to do, and it's just where that came from. It was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. Aware of the time. Any quick questions?
Thank you so much for that, Russ. You began by talking about the 50-year-old accusation that we were nothing but a glorified correspondence college. Nowadays, when we have scarcely any residential schools and students don't have opportunities to meet their tutors and we have no home kits, cheer us up by telling us what we've still got that makes us not a glorified correspondence college from the student's point of view.
Well, I'm not fully up to date with the teaching methods used now, but I understand you're making a lot more use of computing and experiences of that kind. So I'm hoping that makes up for the loss of home kits and residential.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Russell Stannard for an absolutely wonderful talk. I learned so much about what happened before I joined the Open University in January 1971. And I just want to make a few comments. First of all, the recruitment process. I was so lucky to have got the job at the Open University as a lecturer in design, because the first professor of design, Chris Jones, had just been appointed, and he was my PhD supervisor. And I was interviewed for perhaps 15 minutes by the first Dean of Technology, Jeff Hollister, and by Chris Jones, and I was offered the job. And this just couldn't possibly happen today, and not even a few years after that. So thanks very much to the Open University for recruiting me. I'm still here, still working with teaching and research. The other thing is the sheer commitment that the staff at the Open University have had over the years. People would work every minute of the day, and weekends and evenings and holidays. And people didn't take their holidays, basically, in the early years, and probably still don't do today to the same extent. But what has changed, I think, is we were so proud of working at the Open University, and unfortunately I don't feel that quite to the same extent these days. People are moaning rather than being so proud. The third thing I want to say really is the link between the teaching and the research. Working with the BBC opened so many doors, as you said, and so we were able to get access to companies and places which we couldn't have had access to. And that experience and that learning about the subject inside out in order to teach it properly led to research insights, not necessarily in higher energy physics, but in other subjects. I think that's all I want to say about it. I'm still proud to be at the Open University.
Like the other two speakers, I'd like to thank Russ very much. I represent the bureaucracy here today. I started at the university in '69 as Deputy Secretary. What I wanted to ask about, I like many men, and I am being sexist here, in retirement, my plans were very, very fluid, I think you'd say. I only made one decision before leaving the OU at the end of 1998, which I would do S103. I'd applied to do S100 in 1975, knowing how the system worked, but not remembering quite some of the finer details, only to find I got a letter from one of my colleagues saying, "I'm very sorry, Mr. Clinch, you are too late for an application next January, but we'll put you on the waiting list for 76. By this time, the OU was consuming my life, and anyhow, I was off to Pakistan to join as Russ had done, the People's Open University in Pakistan for a secondment for 10 months. I've got a question for Russ, though, because having done S103, you rather glossed over the planning and outline of S100, and I believe that was quite a debate within the science faculty. And as a student, I described the course afterwards as being frankly brilliant. I still think it was a brilliant course. Somehow you took us down from, all this, down to really tiny, tiny things and back again. And it must have been quite a lot of discussion to get 4 separate disciplines to work together in that way.
Yes, it was, because, I myself, for example, never studied biology or earth science. That was my own first encounter with those subjects. And one was expected to make sensible comments on what the biologist had written and so on. So there had to be quite a lot of trust in one's colleagues. Mike Pence, the dean, he made an early decision that although each unit would have a particular author, that author would not be identified in the final materials. The course was produced by the team. So it meant that one was implicated in all the units, which I think is one of the reasons why people were very keen to criticize each other's work, because what he had written was going to be associated with my name. So you had, even within the discipline itself, physics, you had different physicists had different ideas as to how to get certain ideas across, you know. So there was that sort of toing and froing going on within a discipline, let alone be saying to the biologist, I haven't a clue what you're talking about, sort of thing. So those course team meetings, as I indicated, could be very, very difficult and trying. They really were. But as you say, the final product was I think, brilliant. Yeah.
It was absolutely brilliant.
And I didn't mean to be too rude about bureaucracy. I think to be fair, and this is a huge change from those early days to now, which I perhaps ought to have stressed, and that was that in those days, money was no problem. We were the pet of Harold Wilson, and whatever we wanted, we got. So yes, you could make on the hoof a decision to spend hundreds, thousands of pounds on a particular piece of equipment. Later on, when the purse strings became tightened, you have to have serious discussions and weighing up one thing against another. And that's where you get committee meetings, and that's when you get bureaucracy and so on. So eventually, bureaucracy, to some extent, has to be part of it once you're in conditions where money can be a problem.
I think we should end. I want to, with sort of reflecting in a way about what's different about the Open University from what it was. I think there's still a lot that's still the same. I actually think that every single person who works for the Open University now should listen to this. I really do. I'll be doing everything in my power to make it well known, the recording, because it's just been inspirational. So thank you so much for coming. Really, really grateful.